Hi, this is Frank Santopadre, formerly of the Gilbert Gottfried Amazing Colossal Podcast, and most of you have no idea who I am. But because he asked me, because he begged me, because he offered me drugs, you have been listening to the Walter Paisley Movie House podcast. Let me take that last part. Can you sew that together?
Oh, sure. I'm going to leave it exactly as you said it, though.
You've been listening to the Walter Paisley. Boy, it's a shame Dick didn't live to see this. The Walter Paisley Movie House podcast, hosted by the one and only Dylan Rory.
Welcome to the Walter Paisley Movie House, where we celebrate the little engines that could not. Coming to you from Nilbog Manor Studios, our music is by Jonathan Harmon, and I am your host, Dylan Rory. Today's episode is brought to you by Alan Ladd's Free-Range Chickens, where eggs aren't the only thing getting laid. Today's guest is someone I have been hoping to get for this show ever since I began it. He is an award-winning actor and producer behind such shows as The New Gong Show, Fear Factor, The Surreal Life, Jimmy Kimmel Live, I Survived the Japanese Game Show, Last Comic Standing, Crime Scene Kitchen, and the recent reboot of You Bet Your Life. No George Fenneman in that one, though. But the reason he's on this show is because of his involvement in creating the Paragon Cable Access award-winning Beyond Vaudeville, which ran on New York City public access from 1986 to 1996. The show featured celebrity guests, random puppetry, performance artists, outsider comics, and way outsider musicians. Recurring guests like Kevin and Bub, comic Neil Connie Wallace, Austin Velez, Joey the Monkey, and of course Suzanne Muldowney, also known as the Underdog Lady, set the bar for just how strange a cable access show could be. Celebrity guests are a mosaic of legends, both mainstream from the world of cult and television shows as well. Guys, I know these lists get long, but I cut down this one as much as I could. Guests included Kay Ballard, Carol Struycken, Jeffrey Holder, Wavy Gravy, Barry Williams, Joe Fleshaker, Mason Reese, Fred Willard, Al Lewis, Joyce Randolph, Joe Franklin, Brother Theodore, Professor Irwin Corey, Michael Berryman, Michael J. Anderson, Austin Pendleton, you guys, he was in Skidoo, Tiny Tim, Ron Palillo, Kitty Carlisle, Shirley Jones and Marty Ingalls, Kim Hunter, you guys, woof. Larry Storch, the Del Rubio triplets, Billy Barty, Lady Betty Aberlin, Bobby Boris Pickett, Phoebe Legere, Sammy fucking Petrillo, everybody. Come on. And Shirley Stoller. And Shirley Stoller's a legend. I mean, the Honeymoon Killers, Frankenhooker, who's Mrs. Steve on Pee-wee's Playhouse. After running for a decade on New York cable access, the show was picked up by MTV for 66 episodes of Oddville, which was a slightly higher budget extension of what they had begun in New York. Please welcome the man New York Magazine calls the Wizard of Odd, Rich Brown.
Thank you, Dylan.
Hi, Rich. How are you?
Good. It's interesting in that lineup that you chose of our stars on Beyond Vaudeville that you included Joe Flyshaker. It tells me a lot about the show that I'm on here.
Yeah.
You put Joe right up there with Oscar winners Kim Hunter and Shirley Jones.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're focused mainly on cult film, cult television, and I mean, by God, if Beyond Vaudeville doesn't fit that mold, I don't know what does. So let's go back a little bit before we get too deep into it. You grew up on Long Island, is that right? Okay, so like
Long
basically
Island,
the suburbs of New York.
Yep, out in Amy Fisher, Joey Buttafuoco country, and for anyone who remembers those legends, the Long Island legends, and grew up on Long Island and just started getting drawn into the nearby New York City in high school, and
what drew you there? I mean, aside from it's New York City.
It just was at the time, New York City in the late 70s, early 80s was a real interesting place. And there were a lot of characters on the streets, and a lot of those people, that I started befriending, would eventually find their way onto the show, and likewise, even on Long Island, I found myself going to a lot of talent shows at the local Holiday Inn, and Even in high school, like this stuff just attracted me, at an early age.
Yeah. Okay. I can relate to that. So,
Uh,
um, so at NYU is where you started to meet the people who kind of directed the course of your life from there. Of course, David Greene, who became your co-host on this. You guys were both working for The Plague, the New York University humor magazine, correct?
Yeah, I first met David in as a freshman. I took an intro to philosophy class, which was a mistake on my part. I couldn't grasp the whole idea of, is the chair really here if we leave the room? But of course, it was right up David's alley. And but he was a character even then. The first time I saw him, he had a habit of showing up to the class about 3 minutes before the ending bell. And with his he would come in with his Barnes and Noble book bag and his very straight gait, and he would just have this grin on his face, and he would just walk into the classroom and take a seat, and there'd just be a little tittering and chuckling in the classroom, as like, who is this guy and why is he always showing up 3 minutes before class ends?
For listeners who aren't familiar with the show, how tall is David?
Oh boy, I don't know. I mean, he's certainly over 6 feet.
Yeah, he seems so towering on the show and things. So
yeah, and a lanky figure, and yeah, so he's a tall guy. But David is he's a character himself. He's really eccentric but lovable, and it would be challenging sometimes working with him, because he would say that he couldn't predict what he would do when he was on the show, and we couldn't steer him to do anything really. It was when he got in that mode that that's what would dictate his behavior.
So when you guys were starting out and getting to know each other and started talking about doing performances, now I know he did this weird shtick where he'd just fall on the stage and do convulsions, and like that was his act.
Yeah. It kind of grew out of that. He would sit down on a chair, and he would put himself in another zone in his mind, where he was experiencing pain, and the pain would grow more intense the more he would think about it. And so he would get to a point where he would be convulsing and screaming, and we ended up giving it the name Thomas Paine for lack of anything better. What this performance was, but he would also, sometimes he would pretend to be Mr. Serious, and Mr. Serious was a guy that we would, as other college kids, would try to provoke him and poke him, and he would just remain very serious. So it's sort of, I think, what he became on the show kind of grew out of those things.
Yeah. Okay. At what point then, when you're working on this magazine, which is still in print, for listeners, you can find The Plague online. I actually went back and read some of the issues you edited. So it's just a lot of fun.
You can't burn them on the internet.
Yeah. Even though you want to. With coming out of that, was it kind of like, I kind of get the feeling in reading the history, it's a bit like the Lampoon, where it's like, okay, this is working in print. What else can we do with this? What other mediums are there? I know you've credited the Roy Radin's Vaudeville 81 as being a definite influence. It kind of opened your mind as to what was possible on stage. What was that about?
Yeah, the Roy Radin show was it was phenomenal for anyone of us who was into, old showbiz. And
Mhm.
Roy Radin was the impresario who got himself into some trouble during the Cotton Club murders and
Yeah.
wound up in the desert, snubbed in a bad drug deal. But his prior to that,
Mhm.
he was known in some circles for putting together these traveling vaudeville shows, and he'd usually have one comic as a known comic or a once known comic who would host,
Mhm.
and they would introduce about 10 different acts, and they would just travel around to auditoriums. They would usually get deals with local police organizations to try to draw a crowd, and
Mhm.
they go into an auditorium. And I saw one of these when I was still well, I guess I was in college at this point. And it was out on Long Island, and it just really spoke to me. It was, Tiny Tim was there. It was emceed by Jan Murray. They had
Did you say
some guys.
John Carradine was there as
John
well?
Carradine,
Yeah,
yeah, and
that's
that was one of
amazing.
my
That's
favorite
just
moments,
amazing.
because yeah, Carradine, he came out, and by this point he was crippled with
Sure, very
arthritis in his
crooked.
hand.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and he stood at the podium, and this was a crowd of just a lot of like youth groups that I guess had, they just wanted to put these kids into a place. When it was a matinee, they wanted to put the kids into a theater somewhere, and the kids weren't. These kids had no idea who John
What kids
Carradine
is
was,
John
had no
Carradine?
interest. Yeah, and Carradine gets up and starts reciting Edgar Allan Poe, and his microphone goes out. So everything that could go wrong for this poor guy was going wrong. They finally fixed the mic, and the crowd is like really restless of all these kids. And the way the show was set up, the host would come out every so often, but in a lot of cases, they would have the act introduce the next act. And
Okay.
so he finishes, the crowd is just so over him. And he has to introduce the next act. And he says, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Zippy the Chimp. And Zippy, in a little sweater with zip on it, skated out onto the stage on roller skates, and the crowd went wild.
That's amazing.
They were so excited and so
How surreal that must have been.
yeah, yeah. And it just and afterward, one of the great things about these shows is they would travel around the country in a bus. And after the shows in the parking lot, they would all stand outside the bus for autographs.
Mhm.
And that's where I first met Tiny Tim, and who else was there? Judd Strunk, who had been on Laugh-In for a little while.
Mhm.
Johnny Brown, who had been on Laugh-In. And I was talking to Judd Strunk, and could see John Carradine sitting in the bus, just staring straight ahead, and wasn't partaking in the autographs at all. And I asked Judd, like, is Mr. Carradine going to come out? Can we talk to him? And he was like, no, he doesn't. He doesn't really participate in any of this. So it was a very strange final chapter for
Yeah.
John Carradine. And
His arthritis was so bad at that point that I mean he was barely able to move, the poor guy.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it wasn't the right venue, but
Mhm.
but somehow it just all was working for me, just this idea of just this variety of acts of varying levels of quality, and just the whole variety of it, and the
Yeah.
surprise of it. And so, being on the humor magazine, we had an opportunity to do events at the school. And so that was one of the events we did, was a Beyond Vaudeville stage show.
Yeah. So that was the genesis of it then. And the format really didn't change much by the time it made it to cable access. It was your hosting and bringing on just a variety of people.
Well, yeah, I mean, initially we tried a couple of shows, and the host was actually Michael Kaufman, Andy
Oh,
Kaufman's
yeah.
brother,
Hmm.
and we did a few of those, and they were more scripted, and it just got to a place where we wanted to just make the whole thing looser. And Michael was a CPA. It wasn't really, he was sort of dabbling in comedy,
Yeah.
but it wasn't, he wasn't really, he wasn't really interested in continuing with it. And that's when I came in. I had been working with this character and doing some stand up, and then I called David to bring him in, and then yeah, just doing it with a lot of the guys that were there with us on the Plague.
Hmm.
And we went up and we'd rent the studio time for $54.13, I think, each time. And they would give you one camera guy who would jump between two cameras, and
Yeah.
they'd give you a director, and then Steve Korn, who's a guy that worked with me on all the shows. He would be in the booth with the director, and he'd be the
Yeah.
guy saying, "Hey, get the shot of that guy staring while this one is singing," and
Right.
all that. Yeah.
Well, with the stage show, at some point, then you started bringing in also the celebrity hosts like Danny Bonaducci, Al Lewis, and Mason Reese. All three ended up hosting on those stage shows too.
Yeah. Pat Cooper, Barbara Feldon.
They hosted also
Yeah,
on those.
yeah,
Wow,
yeah.
Barbara Feldon, that's great.
Yeah. She was great. She was a good sport, and
How were you
we
making these contacts?
usually in almost all cases they were in the phone book.
Yeah,
This is when there was a phone book,
right.
and yeah, even Imogene Coca. I mean, these are people that were
Wow.
listed in the book,
Yeah.
and I would often book the non-celebrity talent, and David actually would book a lot of the celebrity talent. I would
Okay.
get him the number and say, "Hey, David, see what you can do." And David would be very persistent. If he would call, and if he didn't get an answer, he would call back again and call again, and he would call some of these people daily. And over time, as it sort of compounded. Once we had a few known guests on, David would just read off the list of people who had been on, and
Yeah.
that kind of helped us going forward.
Wow.
And it also helped us that we were flying under the radar, and a lot of people didn't really know or understand what the show was when they were coming in. So
yeah. I know you've got some people who just walked, but for the most part, guests would go in there and stick it out. For the listeners, the show was barely contained chaos. There's constant activity going on within the show. Even when someone's performing, you're all behind them doing whatever the hell you're doing. One of my favorites is you just eating an orange throughout the episode. I think it's a Mason Reese one. Absolutely hysterical as that's going on behind the scenes of everything. And there's puppets coming out of the walls, and it's just craziness. Was the idea that sort of barely contained chaos, it almost comes off as Dadaist, and I'm wondering if that's kind of what you guys were hoping to achieve with it.
I mean, it just it kind of grew out of a couple of things. It grew out of really being a fan of a lot of public access shows of the time, and there was a lot of chaos on a lot of public access shows because people were experimenting, and there were some real eccentrics hosting some of those shows. Change Yourself But Not the World was a big
I know that was an influence for you. That was a hairdresser from Alsace-Lorraine.
Yeah, and his sidekick was like Joe Franklin's errand boy, and he was very hyperactive, and so that created a lot of energy. But growing up with Mad Magazine, and those Sergio Aragonés drawings, and just filling in every space, and and having fun with the filler too. Just it didn't have to all be what was on center stage, and also growing up really enjoying like the Joe Franklin show. The Uncle Floyd show was a show we had in New York, which was, well, it was New York, New Jersey, and getting around there, and and that was always a favorite of ours too. Just that looseness of it, and so that's I don't know, all those things coming together, I think kind of inspired us to do more than just the one person performing to the camera.
It's interesting how it grew into what it when it really hit its peak. I think and for listeners, all of these are available on YouTube, and I'll put links in the bio for this. As you watch it evolve, it really did. All that changes is really the look, the aesthetic, the underlying kind of, I don't know. Well, with David's case, it's just kind of this underlying anger at all times that's going to erupt, while chaos just erupts around him. That stayed throughout, and it's probably one of its best charms, I think. Watching Al Lewis watch a performance artist read poetry with just a baffled expression, where the camera becomes a character, and those are some of the best moments in it, when like you're talking about, the camera switches to watch someone else, like Stryker singing songs about Long Island. It's just insane.
Yeah, but the sets would definitely change, and we'd go through phases, where there'd be certain posters that would be on the wall until we ended up losing them or ripping them or whatever, and then it would change to another poster. But we would always have the way these public access studios would work is you'd have a very small window of time to get in and get out. So so we often would have to just, throw those sets together, and we just come with a bunch of bags of stuff, and everybody would just scramble and tape stuff up anywhere they could and get started, because there was going to be another taping that was coming in right after us. So, so that kind of haphazard look that we had was, dictated in part just not having much time.
Excuse me. Was it the same studio then for anybody doing a cable access? Like, would Frank Massey walk in and set up for Stairway to Stardom right after you guys left and things?
We ended up using 3 different studios. The first studio was like way uptown, really almost like right to the river, like at 218th Street.
Wow.
And then we would alternate between a studio on West 59th and a studio on East 14th. And they both of those studios were privately owned. Public access public access was a big headache for the cable companies. If they had their way, they wouldn't have had the channels at all.
I wish they hadn't thought of it.
And it was dictated, when the Cable Act went through, it was dictated that cable companies, in order to get their franchise, would have to offer up channels so that the community could do their shows. And, with the best intentions of talking head shows with people talking local politics. And but of course that's not what happened, especially in New York. It just, every eccentric in town, wanted to have their own show. And so I mean, the stuff you would see on public access. One night I remember seeing this show where it was like a guy who was naked in his like dirty apartment in the Lower East Side and putting cat food on his groin and having his cat come over and eat the cat food. And so this
Did you try and book him the next day?
he's the one who got away. Yeah, so it definitely wasn't the cable companies didn't want this, but
Yeah.
but people watched these channels. It was we would hear from lots of people, and we'd meet people on the streets, and when we would do our live shows, a lot of people would show up. So in spite of corporate disinterest in it, the shows had followings.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. I mean, I was one of those guys who was on the little underground videotape network where we'd all just kind of meet through snail mail, and we'd send each other video. I'd trade a Herschel Gordon Lewis cassette to get something weird out of New York. And that's how I discovered you guys, was on an old taped over video cassette. I actually remember it was the Al Lewis episode, and somewhere in the middle it glitched and went to whatever it was recording over, which was a soap opera, and then it came back. So I just remember at one point in the middle of it, it would glitch. And so when I finally saw the whole thing, I was like, oh, that's what I missed. But at what point did you guys start feeling that this is growing to something beyond just a regional cable access show?
Well, it really, we were doing it like for 10 years, and we definitely had our moments. It was like when Roseanne and Tom were together, they called me out of the blue, and she was like, I want to produce you, and like, so we would get like bites like that, and they split up shortly afterwards. So that dream,
you had him on the show then too, right?
Yeah. So then eventually when he was coming to town, I was like, well, yeah, you guys aren't together anymore, but we'd love to have you on the show. And he was really nice and came on, and yeah. And when I first, years later, when I first moved out to LA, you mentioned a Gong Show. It was actually it was one of many Gong Show pilots that were done to try to recapture the magic of the Chuck Barris show, and Tom was hosting it, and he brought me in to like work with him on that. So that was like one of my first LA opportunities.
Wow.
Was from Tom. So but anyway, so at about 10 years into this, it really because we would only shoot like maybe one show a month, so that's why even over all those years we didn't have all that many episodes. And I was really getting to a point where I was kind of maybe it's time to wrap this up. We have gotten a lot of attention with it, not really sure where it's going. And then of course MTV called us, and we were able to play for a bit longer.
Yeah. So in the show itself, how much, I know you mentioned earlier that David could be a little difficult to work with because you didn't know what he was going to do, which was a question I had, how much of this was planned? Because there are moments that seem like bits, but it's very difficult to tell. There's one where you've got a Charlie McCarthy doll and he just knocks the head off of it. and I obviously that's staged, the head's just not going to fly off, but then it kind of turned into, how much of this was aimed at making the guest uncomfortable, or was that not your intention at all?
Yeah, that kind of grew. I think we were all big Andy Kaufman fans, right? We all grew up with that. And in fact, I actually met him with one of the NYU events that we had done was a night of pro wrestling, and it was with a wrestling outfit out in Brooklyn, and it was Latino, and they I don't know, the event was a dud. We basically had a big we had a ring put up, and it just had bombed. So I was feeling lousy about it, and we're taking down the ring, and in walks Andy Kaufman, who had seen one of our flyers that we had hung up in Times Square, and he came down to see the wrestling. And
Wow.
And so suddenly the night went from just misery to an amazing moment for all of us.
Yeah.
And he started challenging, some of the women there to wrestle with him, and he was telling us about, well, you've got to do this again, and the next time, you have to make sure you get your one of your deans involved and make him into a bad guy and bring him into the ring. And so that was really cool. But yeah, that, I mean, what he used to do with a lot of his performances, with, giving people that kind of, the audiences, that kind of discomfort, it definitely was something that was appealing to us. And but over time, I was bringing some of that in with myself in the beginning, but then over time, I really took on more of a role of just trying to be the good cop.
Keep it on track. Yeah.
Yeah. And really, because, I really, a lot of these people that showed up on there were people that, I really was fond of. And, William M. Gaines from Mad, and all these people, like, I did want to give them their due in as best I could in that environment, trying to at the same time bring out 8 performers who all wanted 30 minutes apiece, and so that kind of fell on, I think a lot of that discomfort kind of fell on David.
Yeah. It's interesting to watch. You can tell almost immediately the guest who gets it, and they're going to roll with it, as compared to the guests who are like, Austin Pendleton is one of my favorite episodes. It's almost like he's just enduring it as best he can. And then when he and Lady Aberlin get into this long discussion about SAG rules and unions, and it's just so weird. This mundane conversation going on around all this chaos is just so interesting to watch. And it's when those moments where David is really making a guest very uncomfortable, which is noticeable. How much authority could you hold to try and get him calmed down?
Not much, really. And that was, if I come across as kind of nervous and anxious in those moments, it's because I was, David would get physical sometimes. He'd get physical with me sometimes. And one time there was, actually, you mentioned Shirley Stoller earlier. There was like somebody from the back was bringing out a piñata or something.
Yeah.
And he grabbed it with his hand and just threw it, and it grazed her head. And, so there were, and
she was pissed too.
Yeah.
She was visibly pissed.
Yeah. She didn't,
and she doesn't seem like somebody you'd want to piss off.
Yeah. So there definitely were moments like that, or even with William Gaines, he's sitting on the couch and David is like climbing on the couch and he's like right near him. And so there were things like that where, I never would have done it. And I don't know that David himself would have done that, but David in this mode would just do this stuff. And it could get uncomfortable.
Yeah. I was wondering if those moments were embarrassing for you. You're sitting there with a legend like Shirley Stoller, and you can tell, she's pissed.
I mean, definitely there'd be times when, I would want to control, but I couldn't,
Yeah.
it just, there was one show early on where David like took my glasses, he just came over and grabbed them off my face, and I just felt naked, and I'm begging him to give them back, and I'm not sure that he's going to give them back, and it takes him a little bit, and then eventually threw them back to me or something. But yeah, but I guess that spontaneity is a positive thing. I think it's something that really is lacking in a lot of TV now. Everything is so tightly scripted or prepared, and there's not a lot of room for that. So I like it in stuff that I watch, and so we were providing some of that.
For our listeners, can we just kind of walk through a typical episode? For listeners who may not know, let's just say show starts. Where does it go from there?
Well, usually we would start the show as it would be myself, and I'd introduce David, and I would show some knickknacks and tchotchkes, usually pop culture kind of stuff, and I see that stuff now, and I'm like, wow, why did I get rid of some of that stuff? It's so cool, like just weird old Mr. T things.
Yeah, that's exactly the one I was thinking of. Mr. T
and
Bank or whatever.
Different Mr. T stuff and Charlie's Angels and all that stuff, and so we just kind of set the tone, and
with the disco Star Wars theme would play.
We
as you'd go through the handwritten credits, and David would read them. Which was always a joke.
Yes, the only time you would usually ever hear David speak would be him reading off the credits very sternly, and and handwritten credits, so everything was very sort of low rent, and then we would usually introduce the first guest. Sometimes there would be one of our eccentrics already seated out there because we just had so many people. We would tend to overbook the show because we just never knew for sure who was going to show. And sometimes with the celebrities, we would double book, and sometimes they'd both show up, and that's why some shows they would show up like that. But that was usually in a case where we were nervous that somebody might not show up.
Yeah.
Anyway, celebrity would come out, and we would, I would ask them questions about their career. I did research as best I could pre-internet, and then we would just start bringing out the guests. And in most cases, and ideally, the celebrity would stay out there as we'd bring out the next guests. And then the guests would those other guests would just be a variety of people, UFO experts, Marilyn Monroe conspiracy theorists.
Oh, one of my favorites.
All sorts of collectors and would-be performers, and a lot of people that I would meet at science fiction conventions. If I saw somebody who looked interesting to me, I would strike up a conversation, and then kind of go in backwards, figuring out what we would bill them as and what they would talk about. And so somebody would become an expert because they knew a lot about Star Trek, or when all else failed, they'd be a raconteur, or something generic. And one of the things that we would strive for would be to get interaction going among the panelists, because that's where some of the interesting moments would come from. And in the talk shows that I grew up with, there was a lot of that. Jim Franklin did it a lot, and Mike Douglas and Merv Griffin, everyone, had that sort of format where it was there was a lot of the fun came from having these different types of people interacting. And and then we'd have some regulars. We'd have Joey the Dancing Monkey would come out and dance sometimes.
I must point out that my girlfriend kind of looks at him as kind of like an Aztec god. He's always so happy.
Yeah, and he would expand sometimes into plate spinning or musical glasses, and but mostly dancing. And then
Yeah.
we'd have Austin Velez, who would sing
I'm
songs.
assuming he was a friend of you
He
guys.
was another guy from college.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay, I figured that.
um, yeah,
He was always very interesting to watch.
yeah.
Did you
He's
know what he was going to do when he would come on?
no, I mean, I think we would know the song that he was planning to sing when he
Hmm.
was going to sing, and but yeah, he's a bit of an eccentric himself.
Yeah.
Um, and who else? And then and early on we would have Kevin and his friend Bub, ventriloquist, movie reviews,
Hmm.
and not really ventriloquism, just using a ventriloquist gun.
Yeah, it's one of the strangest things.
Uh,
It's it was watching a guy badly ad lib with himself. And it was just these long pauses and things that were so uncomfortable. And you guys, the fact that you let those sit, I loved. I just love that.
Yeah, we would have kept doing those forever, but Kevin eventually he got married and had a family, and he just wasn't, feeling that was going to be a part of his life anymore. So, so we had to move on from Kevin. But yeah, so that would be, the bulk of the show. And then
Mhm.
if usually if somebody were a singer or a comic, we'd let them just kind of stand in front of the group and
Mhm.
do a performance, and then maybe if we had time at the end, we'd get to another. But it really wasn't, it was just sort of loosely blocked out. And I think now that I've worked professionally a number of years in TV, like it there's a lot about it that I love, that that we just had things so loose and we're able to
Mhm.
do so much improvising. And but there but now looking at that through those lenses, there are times with some of the legends that we had on there,
Mhm.
'cause we did have some legends that I wish there could have been a little more time spent with questions with some of them.
Yeah.
But it would have been at the expense of getting to everyone else and having the whole mix and having the interactions and the
Mhm.
reactions and all that. So
Yeah. It, it's interesting around that time, it's late 80s into the early 90s, and a little bit beyond, there was a trend, and I don't know what took us there as a generation, but that whole looking back. And in our case in Indianapolis, we were doing a thing kind of what you were doing, we called it Secret Cabaret, which was it was kind of an anti-open mic where we would I always describe it to people. If you came in with a guitar and said, "Hey, I do Cat Stevens covers," we'd be like, "Yeah, okay." You'd never get on stage. But if you came with bagpipes and said, "I do Cat Stevens covers," we're like, "You're next. Go get it." So it was we were, as a generation, I think we were all kind of drawn to finding that fringe element and highlighting it. And it shows. I mean, what we were doing ended up becoming a literal circus sideshow,
uh-huh.
that's still running today. And that was, you had Jim Rose, you had all these weird things just kind of coming out of the woodwork, suddenly becoming mainstream. You guys were ahead of the curve on that, so it must have been a higher hill to climb.
I don't know, Dylan. I mean, I don't know that interest, that public interest in unusual performers. I don't know that it ever really goes away. It's like you can look back into the early 1900s at Coney Island, where they'd have these midget fills, and
Yeah,
they'd have them all over the country.
you can go back
Traveling.
further to Lepitomane. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Or,
yeah.
in England, in Bedlam, the Bedlam Hospital, where,
Hmm.
wealthy would pay to watch the people in the asylum come
Yeah.
perform, yeah, the sideshow has rich tradition, and it just gets packaged differently for different generations,
Yeah.
and
That's a
and
good,
really
yeah, that's a good observation.
a lot of this stuff is it's embedded in a lot of talent shows, and America's Got Talent has, there have been people that had been on Beyond Vaudeville or Oddville that, wind up on America's Got Talent. And it just gets packaged differently, but I think the interest is always there in these characters and people that sort of march to their own beat, it's never going to be, I don't think it's ever going to be like huge mainstream, but there's always some room for it,
Yeah. It's it's a beautiful thing. And finding shows like Beyond Vaudeville, for me, growing up in Southern Indiana, literally out of touch with everything. I lucked into these little underground tape networks from Fangoria magazine. You find somebody in the back, hey, I've got tapes to trade. You never knew what you were going to get, and sometimes you were unhappy with what you got, but you'd get these gems like Beyond Vaudeville. That's how I just also Stairway to Stardom. I got tapes of Stairway to Stardom, and I didn't know what it was, but I loved every second. And so as those things became more available over time, for you guys, I'm wondering, did you even know that was going on?
Yeah, I mean, we would hear from people in other parts of the country, and that surprised us. But it's exactly what you said about, people just passing around tapes, and a lot of my favorite public access shows weren't preserved. There was Frank Massey's Stairway to Stardom, just benefited from two guys that befriended him and and just got him to digitize his whole library. But in a lot of cases, that stuff was lost. I have a pretty big collection because I always I'd be recording this stuff all the time. And at one point we went from 2 channels to 4 channels in New York of public access. And I was doing a segment for The Daily Show called Public Access, where I would introduce clips of public access.
To add that to your intro. I completely spaced it.
Well, I just bring it up because that was, it really became a job at a certain point of just monitoring what was on at all hours and recording it. And so, yeah, I do have like hours of this stuff, which is, over the years, as I'll dump some tapes on moves, get rid of some stuff, whatever. But those I never, I'll never part with, because they're just ethereal.
It's an amazing history to keep on hand. Do you have plans to digitize those? Maybe make them available?
Eventually, it really is a cool library, and it's funny, stuff shows up on YouTube. People, I guess, like yourself, who had videos that were being passed around, are digitizing. So there is some of it out there to be found, but there's some shows like Richard Rothman, who had Richard Rothman was a guy who he was also an inspiration. He had a public access show early on in the 80s in New York, where basically people would pay to come on his show, and depending on how much you paid him was how much time you got. So just have and he was the guy that when Joe Franklin wasn't going to have someone on his show, he would send them to Richard Rothman. So you kind of had this next tier from Joe Franklin. So it was really a great lineup. And we got a number of our guests came from appearances on Richard Rothman's show. And he would sit at his desk and he would cram into our little studio. When he was doing his show, he'd have 20 people, and they would all be, standing or sitting and all facing the camera, all looking at themselves up on the monitor at the ceiling. And he would just rush them through. And you always knew the person that, either wasn't giving him any donation or, was giving him a very little donation, because they would get you know, 15 seconds, and he'd say, yes, okay. But those tended to be the people that, you know, we would then bring on our show. So they did get their 10 minutes.
Yeah. Of the guests that you had, and I mean, it would take forever to touch on all of them. Which ones would you rank as like maybe your favorites, and which ones were the ones that made you uncomfortable, that made you a little scared? I think it runs the gamut.
Well,
if you're willing to say on the latter, that is, you don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, outside of the celebrity guests, you know, and one of my all-time favorites will always be Suzanne Muldowney, who, you know, friends had told me to check her out. She was showing up at science fiction conventions in costume competitions, dressing up like underdog, because she felt like the cartoon underdog had misrepresented underdog. He should have been a more meritorious character. And anyway, she is extremely articulate, and she is, there are just so many layers to Suzanne. And she is one of those people that, you know, you could just never get enough of, or I could never get enough of her.
Yeah.
And anytime she would come out, she would have plenty to say, and it wasn't just underdog. And eventually the layers of the onion would get peeled, and you'd find out that she was really into also Vlad the Impaler. And she would do these original characters like Spectrum the Ghost King, and just very, and she was very knowledgeable about all these things. So at the same time, she also was among the scarier guests, because she, if she felt provoked, as she might sometimes by David, you know, she would be very threatening.
I heard her in an interview talking about slapping a guy on Oddville after the wedding episode, the guy who popped the balloon. That I think was actually a condom. She talked about going and just slapping the shit out of him.
That surprised him. And at one of the live shows we did at NYU, we had Al Lewis was emceeing, and she was going to be doing her Vlad the Impaler dance. It was just coincidence that, you know, that Grandpa Munster was there when she was doing her Vlad the Impaler. And then on top of that, we had this comedy team of Book and Martino, and they were wannabe Martin and Lewis type comedy. Okay. In fact, Raymond Book, he had studied with Sammy Petrillo. He had and
we're going to be talking about Sammy in a minute.
And so they, as part of their comedy routine, they did a Dracula bit with, you know, Book dressed up with the robe, and he's, you know, doing this horrible accent. Oh, the blood is drowning in my blood. And again, this was just by chance, and Suzanne is just seething, like on the side, like watching this. And when they came backstage, she chased them down, and she had her sword with her for her Vlad the Impaler dance. And she was, you know, kind of holding it up over Book and threatening to skewer him. And I think they got away with a stern warning, but it was a little dicey there.
There you go. That's Rich Brown, part 1. Part 2 will be up in a couple of weeks. If you haven't watched Beyond Vaudeville, I recommend going to their YouTube channel, checking out what they've got there. It is a great show. If you're listening to this podcast, you're obviously into weird shit. This is about the pinnacle of weird shit. You're not going to get much weirder than Beyond Vaudeville. Pretty awesome. A lot of fun. tons of episodes out there. I'll have a link in the bio here to their YouTube channel, so be sure to check that out. You can also find them on Facebook. Find Rich Brown there too. Hey, if you're in the States with me, let's have a great Thanksgiving this week. If you are in one of the many other countries where this podcast is being listened to, you know what? Go ahead and take some time off for yourself. You deserve it. When you get out there in the world, take care of your servers, because it's the Walter Paisley Movie House and we do not piss on hospitality. Until next time, I'm Dylan Rory, and when we get to next time, I'll still be him. Later.